This is an explanation of the fifth argument in my video, a brief argument for Christianity, the immateriality of God. The argument goes as follows. No composite being has existence in itself. Whatever is material is composite. Thus, existence is immaterial. Premise 1 is just the conclusion of the second argument in this series, so I would encourage you to watch that video if you want to know how I come to that conclusion. The second premise technically is about matter and form in the Aristotelian sense, but I don't want to focus too much on that because I know this isn't what most people are thinking of whenever they're talking about matter and form, and I don't think that this is going to be a major objection. That said, matter and form in the Aristotelian sense is what individuates form. In order for God to be material in this sense, we would have to say that matter is what individuates his essence of existence itself, which would obviously be a composition and a violation of premise 1. God also could not just be identical to formless matter, since matter cannot exist without form. As Paul Glenn said, existing formless matter is a contradiction in terms. Existence itself is a form, that is, a determinateness of being. More commonly today, what people mean by matter, I think, is a body, something extended in space. The problem with God, that is, what has existence in itself, being a body, is that everything which is extended in space is divisible. Not necessarily in the sense that we can smash atoms together and physically split them, but in the sense that there's nothing metaphysically contrary to a continuous object being divided. Those parts are not in themselves united. If this were not the case, then it would seem that the space in which this indivisible occupies would also have to be indivisible. We already know that the whole of space is divisible and composed of different parts, say planets, stars, animals, etc. So really the only question would be whether, if we get small enough, do we get to something indivisible? If once you get small enough you were just to get to these indivisible parts, then the whole continuum would be made of these indivisible parts. In order for these indivisible parts to form a continuum, either these parts would have to touch each other or they would have to have gaps between them. If there were gaps between these indivisible spaces, however, what else would be in these gaps other than more space, which would either be divisible or indivisible? So if we're trying to explain a continuum by looking at indivisibles, we have to exclude gaps as an option. If space is composed of indivisible spaces, these spaces have to be touching each other. Now, if they are touching each other, they either need to touch by a part or by a whole. We said that these indivisible parts, however, are indivisible, so they cannot be touching by a part. They don't have parts. Thus, they would have to be touching whole to whole. But if two parts touch whole to whole, they would be transposed over each other, which would mean that they cannot form a continuum. It follows that a continuum, extended space, cannot be made of indivisibles. Thus, it must be made of divisibles, which makes everything in space also composed of divisible parts. If God were some extended object, he would be composed of divisible parts, and thus this would violate premise 1. So God cannot be a body. Now, one last point I should address is that many people will argue that this position contradicts science. Many physicists, for example, believe that quarks have no parts. For this, I will quote a section from David Oderberg. I recognize that physicists currently believe there to be elementary particles, i.e. particles with no structure and no parts, in particular leptons and quarks. But I regard it as a metaphysical rather than a physical truth that no spatially extended object can be essentially elementary and hence indivisible. So I take it that strict metaphysical atomism is false a priori. Leaving aside the raised eyebrows such as a philosophical claim might cause, given the supposed empirical evidence, to the contrary, note that what physicists actually hold is that if quarks, for instance, have a structure, it must be smaller than 10 to the negative 16th centimeter. But measurements cannot yet reach that far. Further, if it turned out that quarks did have a structure, they would, as physicists quite rightly admit, no longer merit the name elementary. What this shows is, 1, that there is at least no law of nature, as currently understood, that prevents quarks from having a structure and hence parts, and 2, that merely calling a particle elementary does not mean that it really is so. It is then unjustified to claim that my denial of the existence of elementary particles has simply been proven false by physics. In other words, the idea of elementary particles have not yet been proven by physics, but it has been proven false by metaphysics. So there is no reason why we should take this opinion about physics to be above metaphysical demonstration presented above. So we have seen that God cannot be material in Aristotelian sense, nor in the sense of being a body. Thanks for watching.